Right, I'm going to make a start. Hello. Welcome to today's seminar hosted by the International Inequalities Institute, LSE. My name is Sam Friedman. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology at LSE, also a faculty associate at the III. Incredibly pleased to be chairing today's seminar titled Lived Experiences of Financial Hardship and Perspectives on Inequality. Can natural language processing techniques assist in the qualitative analysis of large sets of biographical interviews? Talk is part of the II Inequalities seminar series, and today's speaker is Professor Jane Elliott. Professor Elliott is a professorial research fellow at the II. She's leading a fascinating ESRC project entitled UK Voices, New Methods for Understanding the Impact of Social Change on Individual Lives. Jane will talk for 45 minutes as usual, and then there'll be a chance for you to pose questions following the presentation. So we'll take questions from in the room and also online. So I will hand over to Jane. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Sam. It's lovely to be here and be doing a seminar in person, and I really appreciate you all being here in person because it always makes a difference rather than just talking to a screen. I will try and keep to 45 minutes, if not 40 minutes, because this is very much work in progress, and I would really appreciate comments and questions and good engagement. So I hope we're going to have lots of time for that. So what I want to talk about today is very methodological, or probably more strictly about methods. If we're being really purist about it, I'm going to be talking about methods. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit about the context of the UK Voices project that Sam's just mentioned. And I want to have a little detour into what I think are the challenges of conducting really high quality, qualitative research. Little bit on the lived experience of financial hardship and poverty and looking at the existing literature, and then straight on to what we've been trying to do, and this is very much work in progress. So talking to you about some of the interviews that we've conducted as part of the pilot project and some of the preliminary analysis that we've been doing, assisted by GPT 4.0 and NLP, etc. And what I'm hoping is that we can have a really good bit of time at the end to reflect on and discuss the issues of using NLP to assist with qualitative analysis. So this is going to be mainly about methods, but I've decided we really need to have a substantive example in here, otherwise it gets very dry. And you will be able to tell from the fact that I stutter and hesitate over AI and NLP and LLM, that this is all quite new to me. I'm a sociologist. I've always been very interested in methodological innovation. I think it's really important to embrace these new ideas and to engage with them, but I am not an expert. So I will, and also to say from the beginning that I take full responsibility for this presentation, but it's part of a bigger project, and I will give you all the contact details of my colleagues at the end. So I don't want to implicate them at the beginning, but you know, it's not a one-woman show. So to start by saying a little bit about UK Voices. So we've been funded by ESRC for just 9 months from October to June. So it's pretty high pace, bit of work. And the overall vision is to develop a mixed methods data resource. So the UK has got fantastic quantitative resources, and lots of quantitative researchers do secondary analysis of understanding society, the British birth cohort studies, lots of cross-sectional data as well that's archived. But the idea here is, could we have a really huge, useful, broad, qualitative resource that could be used both for solely qualitative research, but also for mixed methods research? And as Sam said in his introduction, our focus is on really understanding individual experiences, given that we're in this sort of state of what some people call polycrisis at the moment, but certainly rapid social change and major contemporary challenges. And it seemed very fitting that I was doing this presentation today, this seminar today, given all the debates about welfare reform and all the announcements that are going to be made this afternoon. So the project has two strands to it, and the usual jargon is to call them work packages, so we called them work packages. So the first part is piloting qualitative interview methods, and the real sort of question we've got here is it possible to do qualitative interviews that will be useful for a range of different projects? Usually people do qualitative interviews that are very specific and focused and look at one topic in depth, but is it possible to come up with a topic guide that will actually be helpful for a lot of different researchers? And then the second work package is more about leveraging AI and NLP tools. And here I've been working very closely with my colleague Travis Cohen at the University of Exeter. And you could say, I mean, I think every project needs an origin story. So we've been inspired by the American Voices project, which has already to some extent demonstrated that you can create a massive qualitative resource. So this is led by David Grusky at Stanford, who I think has visited several times and is coming back in June. So there'll be a chance to hear him in June. And they've already conducted just over 2,700 face-to-face and telephone interviews. They started with face-to-face interviews, then COVID struck, and they moved to distant interviewing. And it is the largest representative omnibus qualitative study in the US. And they took a very sort of statistical sample-based way of constructing the sample. So, you know, sample of counties all over the US, and then a clustered sample within that. So Mike Savage got in touch with me to say, oh, do you know about the American Voices project? Is there a chance of us getting something off the ground in the UK? So that's what this pilot project is all about, is whether by doing some pilot work, we can then give enough resources and ammunition to ESRC to say to UKRI as the sort of major umbrella funder, we need 10 million or more to do a really large piece of UK infrastructure. And there are a number of other countries that are interested in doing something similar. So we've got contacts in France and South Africa, Germany, Denmark, Finland. So we've been meeting regularly to try and cook up this idea that if each country does something like this, there could also be fantastic potential for international comparisons. So that's a bit about the origin story. So there's a couple of sort of key questions then that we're asking. Probably sort of said some of this already. So can we do a really broad but in-depth qualitative interview that's very much participant-led, and would it include detailed enough testimony to be used by a wide range of researchers? And I know this is being recorded. I tend to be a little bit flippant sometimes, just because I think it's important never to take ourselves too seriously in academic settings. But I want to do it better than the Americans, basically. Yeah, that's my flippancy. But certainly the qualitative interview that they've done, it's very, very structured. They've got a very detailed topic guide. And to my mind, the danger of that is, yes, you cover a lot of ground, but it's not fully participant-led. And you can end up with very sort of pat answers to things, and you don't give people the chance to really get into what they feel and what their experiences are. So we're trying to improve on the American model, and we're also dipping our toes into the water of whether you can actually use AI NLP to do analysis. Because if you've got 2,000 interviews, it's clearly not tractable to expect a qualitative researcher to read 2,000 interviews. But can you assist with analysis by using developing tools? And because I think it's always important to actually have some sort of substantive focus, otherwise it just becomes very abstract. Today I'm going to be talking about lived experience of financial hardship. So I said I'd talk a little bit about the challenge of doing high quality qualitative research. I haven't got lots of references here, but hopefully you'll sort of see that this argument makes sense. That I think there's a real danger that qualitative research can almost hide behind the idea of having very small samples so that you can do really in-depth work. And then that's fine if you're very transparent about how you've recruited that sample. But as Malcolm Williams and Jeff Payne wrote about back in 2005, if you actually go through something like sociology and see the sorts of papers that are written, often there isn't much transparency about how a sample was constructed. And so although I would never say that qualitative work has to be generalizable in the way that quantitative work has to be, and you don't have to have a statistically, robust, rigorous, representative sample, you would ideally want to have enough diversity in your sample to at least be able to make some generalizations beyond the immediate context in which the data is being collected. And I think in the UK, particularly, we're pretty bad at that there's quite a lot of slightly shoddy qualitative work, where a lot of the focus is on how good the rapport is with the individuals that you're researching, but there's not much about how transferable those findings are. So that's part of what we're trying to do with creating this very large scale resource. Not saying that everybody has to analyse 2,000 cases, but whenever you are analysing a subset, you've got the broader context. So it's much clearer how your findings would then fit in with, and also people could replicate the research because you've got the sample there as a secondary analysis resource. So there is clearly then this trade-off between detail and diversity and that's what we're struggling with, is can you create a topic guide that gives you enough detail but is applicable to a wide range of different people? So I was recommended this book by a colleague at LSE about 9 months, a year ago. And if you haven't read it, I'd say do read it. It's a lovely read, Qualitative Literacy by Small and Calarco. And it's beautifully written and it's a very quick, easy read, but they're really on the money, I think, about the fact that people rarely precisely define what constitutes high quality qualitative research. And they come up with this very helpful 5-dimensional model. So for Small and Calarco, it's all about cognitive empathy. That doesn't mean sympathy, but it means empathy, so that you really try and understand the respondent's perspective, meanings, and motivations in a deep way. And in order to do that, you need some nuanced questions. So you need to be able to have follow-up questions when somebody says something. And this brings me back to the problem with the American Voices, that it's a bit too crammed, so there isn't time to get that sort of cognitive empathy. But also, and I think this is really important when researching something like financial hardship, poverty and inequality, you need heterogeneity and you need to recognise diversity both within and between cases. So one of the things that I think is really special about qualitative research is you allow people to contradict themselves, to give ambiguous and ambivalent responses. And in a way, that is the human condition. There's no we can't pick a box and put ourselves in the box. The whole beauty of qualitative research is being able to explore those sorts of things with people. But Small and Calarco draw on the sort of social psychological literature to make the point that usually what happens is that a group that is an out group, that is different from you as a researcher, tends to be made more homogenous than it is. And I think that, sitting here, I'm assuming that that we are a group of academics. We share that in common. And of course, for someone who isn't an academic, we're all the same. Yeah, we're academics. We all have traits and behaviours. But for us, we look round and we see ourselves as all totally different. Yeah, so that's all I mean by this sort of out-group homogeneity. And I mean, the other sort of aside I would make that I think is a real problem in social science is how much we're forced into writing journal articles. And so when you're trying to do something like summarise very rich, detailed, qualitative findings within 8,000 words, there is a tendency to create homogeneity and say, oh, there were 1 or 2 key themes and the majority of people said X, and this characterizes the group. So I think Small and Calarco are good at discussing that, and what I would hope is that by having a much larger, more diverse sample that qualitative researchers can draw on, that people are able to really look at that heterogeneity. We've still got the journal problem, but you've at least got a sample that's got the heterogeneity. And in all the briefings that we've been doing with interviewers and in our own interviews, and it's lovely to see that Carrie's here because Carrie did some of the scoping interviews as well. We've really tried to emphasize the importance of these interviews, these qualitative interviews, being participant-led and trying to get interviewees to give us some very concrete, specific examples or specific narratives to avoid the sort of pat generalizations. And I think the final thing I'd say, I mean, clearly you want to be able to probe or prompt to gain richer insights. I think I've already talked about that a little bit. But the self-awareness, I think this is an interesting one, and we'll circle back to this when we talk about using AI, because some of the literature on AI is a little bit like, well, you can't use it at all because it can't be reflexive, because it's not a person. So hold that thought and we can come back to that. So I want to tell you a little bit more about the interviews that we've been doing, and we'll move on to actually show you some examples of what people have said in relation to the financial hardship. So again, to sort of tell a story against myself, we had a big debate about whether you could start a qualitative interview by saying, can you tell me your life story as you see it? And I said, no way. I don't think you can start a qualitative interview like that. It's not, you know, people will just be completely phased. I was wrong. So what we found as a good compromise was that if you let people know in advance that you're going to ask them for their life story, that actually it's proved to be a really good way of building rapport. And it's a really good way of getting someone's sort of context and background. But then you see number 3, daily lives, juxtaposing that with what lived experience is in the here and now. Yeah. And I think I was just thinking as I was walking here about the fact we talk about lived experience and whether we mean lived experience or living experience, because part of lived experience is definitely past tense, isn't it? You're sort of thinking about what you've gone through in your life rather than the real nitty-gritty here and now, what it feels like every day when you get up. And what we're trying to do with these interviews, I guess, is both lived experience and living experience. And it takes a little bit of skill within the interview to get people to do that transition from talking about the past to talking about what life is like in the here and now. And we've tried to aim for a very broad topic guide. So we've just got these 6 really main themes. Perhaps those are the most obvious ones, you know, people's daily lives, their finances, health and emotional well-being. And we end with asking people about how they feel about the future. And interestingly there, most people talk about themselves and their own future. And then it's interesting to probe them and say, oh, that's great, but what about the future of the UK or the future of the world? And getting people to talk about that as well. So to some extent, this is for those of you who are real experts in qualitative interviewing, there's some comparability with BNIM, the biographical narrative interpretive method, but BNIM is even more sort of hands-off and just gets people to tell their story, whereas we've tried to provide a little bit of structure. And again, we had some debates amongst the team and the advisory group about whether you should end the interview with trying to ask some sort of catch-up quantitative questions almost, so that you've got everybody to talk about some of the same things. But we agreed in the end that really this needs to be a qualitative instrument. We don't want to have a checklist of another sort of 10 questions at the end, which are more like the British Social Attitude Survey. You know, what do you think about X, Y, and Z? The other thing in terms of the methods is the aim is for these qualitative interviews to take place with people who've already done some sort of quantitative study. So we would have some quantitative data on people. So in a way, there's no need to do that. But I think, again, in sort of methods terms, it takes quite a lot of imagination to think about what it would feel like to have 2,000 or more interviews like this, because in some ways you want consistency, but in other ways it doesn't matter if you don't get consistency. And I come back again to this idea of participant-led. So in the daily lives section, just to give you a very practical example, one of the young women that I interviewed, she was just talking about her commuting. And she actually talked about, yeah, and I park here and then I walk to the office, which is a few blocks away, and then I walk back in the evening. And I don't know quite how we came to it, but she talked about the fact that it was dark in the evening, and I probed a little bit. And she talked about fear of crime and just how awful it was being a woman in your mid-20s. And then she got on to talking about the Sarah Everard case, which was where a young woman was actually attacked by a policeman, if you aren't up with the UK news from a few years ago. And she was saying about how she distrusted the police, and she gave me a very palpable narrative about how she'd been stopped by the police late at night on the motorway and how scared she'd been. Now, this isn't meant to be about the fear of crime, but to me it was really telling that she gave that much detailed information. And if you've got 2,000 cases, it would be fascinating to look at how people talked about fear of crime, not necessarily in all of them, but at least in some of the interviews, and how that varied according to their demographic and geographic contextual circumstances. So that's a bit about the topic guide. We've done 12 scoping interviews. Well, actually we did 13, but again, hold this thought. One of the 13 said, you're not going to use AI to analyse this, are you? So we've taken that interview out of what we're doing, but it raises an interesting sort of ethical question about whether some people are uncomfortable about it and how much we can inform people or give them informed consent. But hopefully we can come back to that in discussion as well. So let's move on to the very specific literature on lived experience of financial hardship. And I'm sure many people in the room will know this literature better than I do. So this is just a very sort of quick and dirty orientation to the literature. So people like Ruth Lister and in Australia, Simpson Reeves talk about the fact that we've got lots of statistical numeric summaries of poverty and lots of arguments about how you might measure poverty, but that we need to go beyond those statistics to understand people's real experiences and what it feels like on the ground to have financial hardship. And increasingly, there's been participatory research to say that you really need people who are going through that to help inform the research agenda and design the research. So there's now, I mean, you can do a quick sort of literature search, and I've just picked out a few sort of key themes here, but a lot about parents and children. So that Hooper et al. Paper, I think it was York and London, they did some work, and it's sponsored by a think tank, so it's a report rather than a journal article. I've got a list of references at the end, by the way, and all my slides are a free resource to people, so don't worry about taking notes and things. And then sort of thinking more about sort of discourse analysis, people like Shildrick and MacDonald talk about how people in poverty talk about poverty, and the fact that often people going through financial difficulties don't actually define themselves as poor. Again, they did their study in 2 areas in the northeast of England. So they identified places which were known to be places where people were suffering, you know, there were sort of estates that were known to be hard up. Then there's more cross-national work as well. Walker et al. Did a study in 7 different countries looking at whether shame is something that is found in all accounts of poverty across a number of different cultural contexts. And then much more recently, Kate Summers and a whole team here at LSE have done welfare at a social distance, where they did interviews with about 73 people and then did repeat interviews. So that's looking at poverty and hardship, but very much in the context of the welfare system. And of course, in the last few years, there's been a lot about energy poverty. So the Heredia et al. Paper does a literature search, a sort of meta-analysis, and finds, they've sort of found 100 papers that were about energy poverty. So there is no shortage of accounts of what it feels like to suffer financial hardship. But there are a number of major shortcomings, which I think would be ameliorated, would be combated by a much larger scale resource of qualitative interviews. So firstly, and Kate Summers and colleagues make this point, that almost all samples are recruited via support agencies. So you don't actually get any sort of representative or varied sample of people going through financially hard times. You get a particular type of person who has interacted with a support agency. You often get samples from one or two specific geographic areas, so you get to know what it feels like to be poor in a poor neighbourhood, but not what it feels like to be poor in a broader sense. And of course, a lot of focus on families and children. So the question is, could you use a large-scale resource to complement these existing studies? And throughout this, I'm not trying to say that this is a panacea, that a big qualitative resource means you don't need to do any small-scale qualitative studies, but I'm seeing it as a complement. So as I said at the beginning, we're sort of tensioning this idea of a big resource with the idea of, can you actually use LLM and NLP to assist with the analysis? And I think we're all aware that ChatGPT has sort of taken the world by storm in the last couple of years, but it itself keeps evolving. So we sort of go from ChatGPT 3 to 3.5 to 4. So it's dramatically improving in functionality. And these developments in AI and the use of large language models mean it's much easier to process large quantities of text. And just as there's a huge literature on financial disadvantage and the difficulties of poverty, there's also now an enormous academic literature on how qualitative analysis might be assisted by NLP. And what's been really special about the project that we're doing in this 9-month window is having a chance to work with computational social scientists and understanding how difficult it is to do that interdisciplinary work. But I think it's absolutely invaluable. So just since, in 23-24, there's an enormous amount of new work that's been done using LLM and seeing whether it can be applied to qualitative analysis. And it's really, it's always difficult because I don't know who in the room is an expert. So I don't want to patronise anybody, and hopefully this can come out in discussion more. But these are things that I've only sort of learned in the last few months. So I suppose I've always seen the sort of computer-aided work on text as the text as being a bag of words. And I've used things like NVivo for years and Atlas TI I used to do my PhD many years ago. And that's very good at doing things like keyword in context. It's very good at word searching. But as I understand it, it's these new transformer-based models. So ChatGPT, the T apparently stands for transformer. And what it means is that the model is actually able to pay attention to the whole text in a much more human way than we've ever been used to before. So it's no longer the case that an interview transcript is just a bag of words, as it would have been once. It now really is a meaningful piece of text that the LLM can engage with. So in terms of doing a very sort of rapid review of the literature, a sort of key message that comes through is it's worth doing this because it's so time consuming to read lots of text manually. And because there's such a wide literature, there's also a wide range of qualitative materials that are used. It's not all about interviews. Sometimes it's also about social media, interview transcripts, essays, open-ended questions and things like that at the end of more quantitative study. And there tends to be, there's almost, if I was going to really simplify it, I'd say there's two main strands of literature. So there's one very boring strand that says we did X and Y and we tested generative AI stroke LLM models against humans. And then it gives you some figures and says how good it is or how bad it is. So that's one that I'm oversimplifying. But then there's another strand of literature that basically, and again, to be a bit jovial and oversimplify it, that says qualitative analysis is all about empathy. Machines can't be empathic, so machines cannot do qualitative analysis. So that's slightly over-characterizing it. But they're often in the sort of measured conclusions, people will say it can only be used in conjunction with human code as an analyst. But I think one of the sort of issues that comes up here is how much people get carried away by the idea of the large language model, whatever the tool is, actually doing the analysis versus being an assistant in the analysis. Again, we can sort of come back to this at the end. But I've been thinking, you know, why is it that we don't worry about using word processing packages to help with our academic work? I mean, maybe people did back along. They said you can't think properly unless you've actually got pen and paper, and that's the real way of scholarly work. Yeah, we don't worry about that. We really do just see Word or whatever we use as a tool. So why is that all right, but using our AI quite problematic? And I thought, well, in a way, it's obvious, because what is happening is AI is being made to feel more and more human. So we don't think of ourselves as anything like a word processing package. It's a completely different task that's being done. But it is quite interesting to think about a machine, a computer program, being able to read text and understand it. And how, as humans, do we really think that through? And how much do we understand how much the computer is understanding it? And I suppose I would argue, and we'll come on to the example here, that the only way that you can really understand what's happening is to have a go with it. It's very difficult to get somebody to really describe to you what's happening behind the scene. It's a bit of a black box. But by working with AI, you can get more of a sense of what its limitations and capabilities are. So what we've been doing with colleagues at Exeter is they've been developing a chatbot to assist us with our analysis. So in terms of the part of the ethics of this, it's very deliberately in a closed system. So it's possible to set up a closed environment where the large language models cannot use our interviews to train the model any further. So I think it's important to say that at the beginning. And then the aim has been to build an API such that you can put multiple interview transcripts in at the same time that can be read simultaneously by what are called agents, just as a way of sort of describing them. And what we've been aiming to do is really just to get these agents to extract paragraphs that are relevant to a specific research question. So it's like a very simple version of coding, sort of first level coding, that then we would go and look at as researchers. So the reason I've got these numbers of 12 and 73 is, as I mentioned, we did 13 scoping interviews, 12 of them are being analysed, and 73 are interviews that have already been collected as part of the Welfare at a Social Distance project. And again, I'm at the boundaries of what I've been learning here. I just want to be really honest with you. So there's this particular way of doing this work, retrieval augmented generation. So what the large language model is doing is chunking up an interview into paragraphs, which it thinks of as vectors. And then there's like two stages. So one is you put in a prompt, and I'll show you an example in just a sec. And it says, is this interview paragraph relevant to this prompt? Does it answer the question in some way? So that's the first thing. And you set a limit of, I only want up to 24 paragraphs per interview, but you can, as the user, you can define that. And then the second phase is a sort of second filtering, where you then use the augmented generation part of RAG to say which of these 24 are the most relevant, so that the user doesn't get things that aren't very relevant. So it's a sort of extraction or retrieval followed by filtering is basically what's happening. But all of this is underpinned by large language models. And what we're spending our time doing is really testing the system and wanting to reflect on how the use of these sorts of tools impacts the type of analysis that you can do. And that's what seems to be missing a bit from the literature at the moment, that it's either very technical, what's the intercoder reliability between humans and the machine, or it's very ethical, let me describe to you what humanistic qualitative research really is and why a machine could never be used to help with it. So what does it look like in practice? So on the left-hand side, you can see the sort of filter system that we have. So you can filter interviews by a number of basic demographic characteristics. And then on the right-hand side, this is the output that you would get. So these are our participants labelled with letters. These are our 12 scoping study participants. And there's a little box at the bottom where you can ask a question, and you can see the query that I put in at the top, and it tells you how many paragraphs it's found. So it's a very, very basic user system at the moment, user interface. It's not worth us putting a lot into developing the perfect user interface because things are moving on so quickly. And then what we do with that is you can then output the paragraphs that have been found to be relevant into, this is just an Excel spreadsheet. So the final column at the end here is just the beginning of the text that has been selected out. So we did do a little bit, a tiny bit of chatbot versus coding by social scientists testing, just because we're playing with this really. We're trying to experiment with how it works. So with the 12 scoping interviews, I asked the chatbot, what do interviewees say about their lived experience of financial hardship? And the chatbot found 68 paragraphs, okay, which I then read each of. And I read them and I thought, it's got too many false positives here. There's a whole lot of things here where I would not say this was financial hardship. But I did then find it really interesting, and you'll see some examples, to think, oh, actually, I should broaden my definition. But anyway, interview A, chatbot extracted 4 paragraphs, and I asked 2 colleagues to test it. One extracted 21. So to my mind, there were even more false positives. And social scientist 2 extracted 9 paragraphs. But in extracting them, actually sent me lots of notes saying, well, actually, this isn't really about financial hardship, but it's sort of about money. So you probably want this. And when I talked to colleague number 1, who'd extracted 21, they explained that as an anthropologist, if they were writing up the interview, they would want all this contextual information because it's about finance. So it was an interesting insight into even when you're working with other people who are people, they will have different interpretations of something like financial hardship. So what sorts of things came out? So I just wanted to give you this example to really understand that it was very automated. I just said, I literally like very short sentence. What do interviewees say about the lived experience of financial hardship? So that's what I was asking the chatbot. It was not doing a word search. It was not looking for finances or hardship or lived or experience. It was doing a semantic search. So it was in some way understanding them. And from the 68 paragraphs, I then read through each of them, and I know a bit about the interviewees, so that helped because I'd already read the interviews. And so then this was me thinking, well, what are the themes and social narratives that come out here? And there's quite a lot. So I'm not going to have time, particularly because I'm going to talk for about another 4 minutes to go through all of these. But just to give you a sense of what comes out. So very unsurprisingly, material deprivation. These are the sorts of things I think you could write about without doing any interviews. Yeah, just from common sense about lived experience of financial hardship. But there's still some quite interesting things that came through here. So linking politics and Rishi Sunak and inequality to financial hardship. I'm not going to read these out. I'm going to let you skim read them because that's by far the most effective way of doing it. But also people talking in very sort of palpable sense. This was a young woman in her early 30s, and she talked several times about super noodles and how that had been her sort of go-to food when she was trying to save money. So material deprivation. But the other thing that struck me, because I've just been given this text by the chatbot, was just if you wanted to do a discourse analysis, you could then quickly look at what sort of language was being used. And it made me realise that we often talk about making ends meet. And I must admit, I used Wikipedia to try and, where does that phrase come from? Because it's a very standard phrase. And a lot of the phrases that people come up with just scrape by, money was tight. There's a whole set of vocabulary that is just so familiar to us. And it's not that the chatbot was telling me, oh, this is discourse, but it was much easier for me to be able to spot it because the chatbot had done the filtering and given me the paragraphs that were relevant. But this was perhaps what I found most intriguing, was this linking of money management and identity. So this was very much prompted. So it's almost like I felt I got a very different sort of research collaborator by working with the chatbot. Because as I say, I felt when I first read through things that there were a lot of false positives. But here it's quite interesting. It's not, to my mind, exactly lived experience, but people talking about their identity, and not always in a very flattering way about themselves. Interestingly, and I'm not going to make a gendered point here really, because it's too small a sample, but C and I were both men. C was just about retired. And he says, we're not very good at spending in our means. We enjoy enjoying ourselves. So it was very much part of his identity, not being good with money. Person I was a much younger man, but a similar sort of idea. When I've had money, I've spent it irresponsibly. And these are the sorts of bits of testimony that I think we don't hear as often when people are talking about money. But then P and Q are both women who were talking much more about how they relished the prospect of budgeting and planning and thinking ahead. So it was a different way in which money was important to their identity. So this isn't a substantive paper, and hopefully we can discuss these a bit more, but I just wanted to give you some actual tangible examples to see how one might work with one of these chatbots and how there's still a lot of human interpretation and summarising that's going on here from me. And then the final one was the idea, and again the chatbot found this, the idea that the UK is struggling. So not thinking necessarily about themselves as people, but talking much more broadly. And a lot here about the NHS, which perhaps is what we would expect. But again, I'm trying to hopefully demonstrate how if you didn't just have 12 of these interviews, but you had 1,200 or 2,000, it would be fascinating to see the sorts of things that people talked about in terms of their perceptions of the UK and what's going well or badly. So I've got next steps. Good. So this is just to lead us into a discussion. So what do we need to do next? So firstly is really understanding the best way of doing semantic searching. As I said, semantic searching is not the same as keyword searching. And it's taken me the sort of experience of doing it and experimenting with it to really understand that. And again, to be very jovial, I did try looking, I said, when do interviewees use swear words? And it couldn't come up It was really bad at finding that. And then I thought, well, it's been really bad at that, so I'm going to be really specific. And I said, when do interviewees say shit? Because I knew that this was said quite a bit in interviews. And again, it was terrible at finding them. There are lots and lots of false negatives rather than false positives. But talking to computational social scientists, they said, well, of course, because it's not searching for words. It's a semantic search. So that's something that I think as social scientists, we need to work in an interdisciplinary way. So through that sort of debate, we realised that we do actually, any sort of chatbot facility would need to have a keyword in context search, because that is a way that we often do qualitative research, is to be able to go backwards and forwards between semantic searching and looking for specific words. But I also think, you know, we need to engage in much more discussion and debate about the strengths and weaknesses of using large language models, and to not be phobic about it. But also, I think some of the reasons that people are so negative about using AI and large language models is because there's been so much hype about what they can do. So I feel the responsible thing is to engage and to really discuss and experiment to find out what they can do. So hopefully we can have some questions and discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, then. That was fascinating, provocative, very lots of, I think, interesting angles to pick up on. So let's open the floor for questions. For those of you online, if you can just sort of use the raise hand function or pose your questions or paste your questions into the chat with name and affiliation where possible. But we have questions in the room to start us off. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you define the limits of where you're gonna use like the AI? Like you specific talk about coding, but in transcribing the interviews and conducting the interviews, have you thought of using AI?
Great question. So I know there are some other economists in LSE who have been doing some experiments with using AI to do interviews. It was never planned to be part of this pilot project, but in writing up for the funders, we'll certainly mention it. The problem, of course, with using AI as an interviewer is that it has to be textual. And it's a slightly different, I would say it's quite a radically different interaction than with a human. But for some specific research questions, I'm sure it would work. But I don't think when you're trying to do these sort of very broad omnibus type interviews, they would work. We haven't been using AI for transcribing, but clearly that is being increasingly used. And I think there's many different ways, and it will develop over time in which you could use with AI for helping with qualitative work. I suppose because the context is this very big study, I'm imagining that we would want to be showing how it could be used to identify small groups of interviews within 2000. Because there's all sorts of hidden things about people where if you try to do a sample, it's really difficult to work out how you would recruit them. So the example we often use is pain. If you want to do a study on how people experience pain, how do you find those people? And with financial hardship, how would you find a sample of people that had at some point in their past really gone through a period of financial hardship? But using the chatbot, using AI and NLP, you could extract a certain number of interviews. But that's very different from creating sort of thematic analysis where you give it 20 interviews and say, what are the main themes that appear here? So I think there's so many different ways. And I wouldn't say rigidly you can use it for some things and not others. But I think I would say rigidly you always need a lot of human intervention.
Thanks a lot. Really interesting way. Not about any of the next steps, actually. People about their history in a way. So you said that you already told some people that you were going to be asking about this, and then I'm thinking to have something like, is there any kind of bias of people who gain, I don't know, not traumatizing experiences, but various interviews. Out, and then the other one is the other one, if making people in advance think about their life. And maybe, I mean, I don't know what course is going to be at play, and maybe making them think about hardship. How will that influence their feeling of now, of what's going on in their lives nowadays? Like, what do you think could be going on there?
Yeah, so there's so many things that could be going on. And I think it's important to say, in terms of the methods, we're not expecting to get the one true story of someone's life. But all of us will tell different stories of our lives, depending on who we think our audience is, how long we've got, what the context is. And from day to day, we will tell a different story about whether we're now in a fantastic relationship and having a great career, or whether everything's terrible, just to be. But the idea is that if you're doing 2,000 or so interviews, that what you're really just trying to give people a chance to say what is important to them. And at a very practical level, if somebody has had particular life experiences, if you start with a whole set of questions, they're sort of busy trying to say, but that's not relevant to me. But if you give them the chance at the beginning to say, I haven't had children, but I never wanted them, or I've got 6 children and that's what defines me, just it gives them that opening to say it. So it's more about putting them in the driving seat than thinking that you're going to get the story.
And is there any pattern that people think that they will?
People are very, I mean, people were surprisingly competent at telling their life story. There were some examples. Travel seems to be something that people can get a little bit obsessed in the weeds of exactly where they went, when, and so then as an interviewer, you have to say, well, actually, enough already. You know, you're still only 21 and you're now 62, and we've only got 5 minutes. And then there was one woman that I interviewed who just said at the beginning, well, my life, it didn't start out well, but I'm very happy with where I am now. And she was almost like giving the abstract of her life. So I had to then do a bit of work with her and say, no, but I really am interested in your life.
Okay.
The first question is from Sarah Morgan Trimmer. They are wondering why you developed a chatbot rather than using an acronym CAQ-DAS with LLM-based AI functions.
Yeah, great question. CAQ-DAS is the generic term for computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software.
Nice.
There we go.
Very nice,
So those packages are a little bit behind the curve in what you can do, and you don't actually know exactly what they're doing because I'm not best friends with the developer of NVivo or Nudist or whatever. So the idea was developing something up to the minute with computational social scientists with a much more specific thought of, could this be used for 2,000 interviews? Whereas the other thing is, having used NVivo a lot, it tends to fall over if you have more than amounts of 60 or 100 interviews. So they're not really designed. So it's not to say that you couldn't also use those packages, but you'd be more likely to use them once you'd already filtered out a small sample of interviews.
And then there's one other question. From Carla Mocha, who is a second-year PhD student at the University of Sussex, doing qualitative research on perceptions of economic inequality from a bottom-up perspective. To provide some context for their research, but their question is if they found discussion of access to social opportunities in the research that you've done so far.
So I would say I haven't done enough because we've just been doing it with the scoping interviews. Having read quite a lot of the welfare at a social distance interviews as well, they're very focused on people's experience of welfare rather than social opportunities. So I think, I mean, certainly you could use that lens to look the scoping interviews, and people certainly did talk about their backgrounds and the opportunities they'd had. So there was a slide early on about material deprivation, but it also had a thing about a person Q said there was never any money for aspirations when I was young. So there certainly is evidence of that. But I suppose, you know, overall, the aim would be that second year PhD students in the future, if this resource gets built, would be able to go to something like this and say, what evidence is there of this? And then do I need to go away and develop my own topic guide to look at it in more detail and my own sample? So thank you for those two questions online. I'm sorry not to see you in person. No, that's fine. And I can hang around a little bit at the end. So if anyone wants to collar me, and all this is a resource, and if anyone wants to email me, then I'm at that point in my life.
So, a couple of questions. One, I was wondering so far if you've chosen a fairly, you might say fairly simple or straightforward research question to sort of pose to the model here. Do you think that it would have different results, or there would be, have you tested the idea that if you plug in, I suppose, a more, potentially more socially complex phenomena question? I mean, in my head I was thinking, you know, something perhaps around discrimination or robbery, something that's, would there then be a difference in the ability of the bots to generate meaningful or extract meaningful data from that? But I wondered if you sort of tested that. You mentioned that this, I suppose this is connected. You mentioned that these more colloquial phrases for phenomenon that we understand inherently because we hear them in everyday life, but they're often quite strange in terms of their etymology or what's happening. Did those actually come from the bot? Actually noticed them?
Yeah,
That's interesting.
so the bot noticed them. The bot didn't say, "Oh, Jane, look here," but it was coding up those paragraphs
Because it semantically made sense.
Yes, because it's got a huge amount of language in its memory. Coming to your question about the more complex concepts. So I don't want to get too much in the weeds of the process that we've gone through, but this is like the second or third iteration of the chatbot. An earlier one, we did some more systematic testing, and I did do things like, can you find regret? And can you find racism? And it certainly can find some of that. And people talk about the difference between zero-shot searching and sort of learned searching. So you can actually say to it, by regret, I mean missing out on something that you wished you had done. You can actually give it quite a big definition of what you mean by something. And I think that the problem is, and this is why it's good to actually experiment and work in an interdisciplinary way with other people developing, is that different types of language models and different approaches give you better or worse responses to some of these questions. So ideally, I think we'd want to develop a suite of, and not necessarily, I don't mean we, our little team, I mean as social scientists, a suite of very well-defined tools that people would turn to depending on what sort of question that they had.
Maybe one just more provocative question, just sort of, you know, what I've heard sometimes from other qualitative sociology more generally, but I can see where it comes from. The idea that you sort of open a Pandora's box here. So, you know, what you've stressed, I think, in a very logical, sensible way is that, you know, we can already see from doing this that, you know, how much human input is necessary to marshal these tools. Is there an argument, though, that you sort of open the door to using this kind of technology, and then that starts a process of normalizing, which eventually leads to the justification of sort of technology-only analysis, and that is in itself something that we as a research community follow. And so that might be an argument pushing back even at this stage.
Yeah, Brilliant question. So I was talking to somebody from a government department a few weeks ago who raised this very problem that they have as civil servants, that they are trying to commission large scale policy relevant qualitative research, and increasingly they're getting people putting in for tender and saying we can do this really cheaply and really quickly because we're using AI. And some senior civil servants are saying AI, fantastic, yeah, we've got to have that. But as government social researchers, they don't have a way of evaluating whether this is actually going to be high quality social research or not. And I think the parallel here is things like SurveyMonkey, that SurveyMonkey's been around for ages and similar packages. But the trouble is, it now means that everybody is doing very bad surveys, whereas when I started out, and you spent a lot of time designing a really good survey because it wasn't technically easy. But I think that that's even more reason that we should be engaging with it rather than resisting. I'm not, but that's my personality. I'm not a resistor. But I do think as social scientists, we should be aware that the world is changing. And it was fascinating in the scoping interviews that several people actually talked about using ChatGPT. There was somebody who was starting her own entrepreneurial business, was talking about how they were using it for a website. So even sort of within the study, it's like, how is ChatGPT becoming normalized and used by people, and how do they talk about it? Great question, thank you.
I think we're out of time. But just on behalf of everyone, massive thank you to Jane.
Thank you.